Today we're going to make a classic, the Singapore Sling. For this drink, you're going to need a Collins glass, a jigger, a cocktail pick, a fancy straw, a cocktail shaker, a cutting board and a small knife, and a citrus juicer. This drink uses gin, cherry liqueur, Benedictine, Aromatic Bitters, orange bitters, simple syrup, soda water, fresh lemon juice, and optionally a lemon wheel, mint, and a Maraschino Cherry for garnish. Like most of its fellow famous drinks, there's a lot of mystery around the origin of this one. And unlike the Manhattan or the Negroni, where there's at least a ballpark standard for the recipe, with the Singapore Sling it's hard to find a consensus. It'll usually be made with gin, lemon juice, cherry liqueur, Benedictine, and soda. But there's sure to be different opinions on that. The most common origin story is that it was created at the Raffles Hotel in 1915 by Ngiam Tong Boon. But the real story is a little more complicated. In the 1860s, Singapore officially became an English colony, as well as the rest of the Straits settlement. It was a bustling port town, and with the opening of the Suez Canal shortly thereafter, it became one of the most important ports in the world. The Sling was a category of drinks that dated back to at least the early 1800s. It was essentially a basic template, just sugar, water, spirits, and ice. Kind of an old-fashioned, without bitters. According to David Wondrich, the Sling seemed to be an American creation, but the English took the name and ran with it. Throughout the empire, English bartenders would add their own embellishments. They moved further and further away from the American idea of a sling, and turned it into more of a punch, by adding citrus, bitters, and/or liqueurs. And a common sling they loved to embellish was the Gin Sling. For the locals in Singapore, what later became known as the Straits Sling or the Singapore Sling was originally referred to simply as the Gin Sling. The earliest known recipe was from 1913 and consisted of equal parts gin, cherry liqueur, Benedictine, and lime juice, as well as a couple dashes of bitters. But there are references to Singapore's popular pink-colored sling in the local papers dating back to the 1890s. The drink appeared in a cocktail book in 1922, before popping up in several books in the 1930s, where it was sometimes called the Singapore Sling, sometimes the Straits Sling, but always built around a similar combination of ingredients: gin, lemon juice, Benedictine, cherry liqueur, soda water, and bitters. The drink also became a popular fixture on Tiki menus. This dates back to the founder of Tiki, Ernest Raymond Beaumont Gant, later known as Don Beach. According to Tiki historian Beach Bromberry, as a young man, Don took what was supposed to be his college fund and decided to spend it all on a sailing trip around the world. In the 1920s, Don traveled through the Caribbean, South America, Africa, Southeast Asia, and of course Polynesia. During this multi-year voyage, he fell in love with Polynesia, and he fell hard. But while he was out in the South China Sea, Don visited the Raffles Hotel. And while he may have encountered the drink at the hotel, he no doubt came across it during his time in Singapore. In 1931, after the money ran out, Don washed up stateside in Los Angeles. He opened a bar in the heart of Hollywood called Don the Beachcomber. As with other venues in Tinseltown, like the Chinese Theater or the Egyptian, which was directly across the street, Don gave his bar a theme that transported his guests to another world, one that was just adjacent to reality. He decorated his bar with artifacts he gathered from his time island hopping around the Pacific. And right alongside several of his original creations, Don put the Singapore Sling on his menu. Don's bar was a phenomenon, and soon after imitators started popping up left and right. They copied his decor, his themes, and his menu. Don was extremely secretive about his recipes for his original creations, but luckily the recipe for the Singapore Sling was available in several contemporary cocktail books, so it was easy for the other tiki bars to adapt it to their menus. As for the drink's rumored origin, like most good myths, this one was at least partially anchored in the truth. The legend of Ngiam Tong Boon inventing the drink in the hotel in 1915 almost certainly comes from Roberto Pregertz, the Raffles Hotel manager from the 1970s and 80s. Pregertz was a shameless marketeer who didn't let facts get in the way of a good story. He ferociously promoted the idea that Ngiam created the famous drink, and most importantly, at the hotel. But there were a couple things wrong with the story. For one thing, Ngiam died in 1915, while he was over 1,000 miles away in China. For another, the drink was a staple throughout Singapore nearly 20 years earlier. Also, Pregertz claimed that Ngiam used pineapple juice in his recipe. This is particularly suspect. and not backed up by any of the accounts of the drink in print. Pineapple juice is something that came from Pregertstein, not Ngiam's. Cocktails that were overloaded with juice were a hallmark of 1970s bartending. Drinks had morphed into being as sweet as possible, and to fully mask the flavor of booze. This is the same reason why the Jungle Bird, which was created around the same time in the 70s, just north in Kuala Lumpur, was originally made with so much pineapple juice. And this is all compounded by the fact that the hotel later confessed to not having the original recipe at all. The most accurate part of the story was that Ngiam Tong Boon worked at Raffles. He was a Chinese native who trained as a bartender in Vietnam before coming to Singapore. And somewhere around the turn of the century, he secured a spot tending bar at the prestigious Raffles Hotel. Raffles opened up as a hotel in the late 1880s. And while it may be possible that Ngiam was there in the 1890s and the drink started popping up in print, there doesn't seem to be any documentation backing that up. However, several influential people seem to have encountered the drink at Raffles, and they helped make the drink world famous. Another common myth about this drink is that it was originally made with cherry eau de vie. This is mostly because of the appearance of dry cherry brandy in the 1922 recipe. But this belief was put to rest by David Wondrich, who unearthed the early evidence of the drink's signature pink color, and that some of the early 20th century cherry liqueurs are marketed as dry. Even though I don't use the fabled pineapple juice recipe, I did use a pineapple cocktail pick as kind of a nod to the other version. Garnish the drink how you like. I put together a cherry, a lemon wheel, and some mint, which is more or less the Trader Vic's garnish from the 1940s. Because it was based on a punch, and no one can agree on the recipe, not to mention that it was a staple in mid-century tiki menus, the Singapore Sling really fits in as a tiki drink. As for the rest of the ingredients, this recipe follows a basic template from the early 20th century. But again, there's not exactly a standard recipe. I tried several versions of this drink side by side, and the Smuggler's Cove recipe is definitely my favorite. It's pretty much the 1930s version, only with a little simple syrup to help balance it out. But we won't hold that against it. Before I get started, I like to cut, squeeze, strain, and bottle my lemon juice. That way it's easier to pour when it comes time to measure. Next, prep your garnish. Slice off a wheel of lemon, then spear it and your cherry on your fancy cocktail pick. Fill your glass up with ice. Measure 2 ounces of soda water, and pour that in your glass. Then measure 1.5 ounces of gin, add that to the shaker. Measure 3/4 ounce of lemon juice, add that to the shaker. Measure 1/2 ounce of cherry liqueur, add that to the shaker. Measure 1/4 ounce of Benedictine, add that to the shaker. Measure 1/4 ounce of simple syrup, add that to the shaker. Give it a dash of Aromatic Bitters and a dash of orange bitters. Add ice, then give it a good shake to chill it down and give it some dilution. Strain the contents of your shaker over the ice in your Collins glass. Then drop in your lemon wheel and cherry, slide in your fancy straw, and work in your mint for garnish. And there you have it, a gin sling straight out of the Straits Settlement, the Singapore Sling. Akole Maluna. You can support this channel by clicking on the Patreon link here. Check out some more videos. Be sure to subscribe and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For links, more info, and the printed recipe, check out the description below.